How do cosmic events affect the Earth? Do rivers deserve legal rights? Why were some astronomers convinced that Mars has canals? What happens when brains malfunction? Those are some of the questions that crop up in the books that we've selected as the top science books of the past year. This is BookLab. Welcome to episode 40 of BookLab, the podcast where we check out what's new in the world of popular science books. I'm your host, Dan Falk.
And I'm your other host, Amanda Gefter.
2025 was a good year for science books. The past 12 months have given us books on all manner of scientific subjects, from astrophysics and human biology to AI and ecology.
Dan and I are going to be talking through some of the books we liked and the books we loved from the past year, working our way toward our favorites. So do listen all the way to the end, where we'll each reveal what we think is the best science book of the year, along with a runner-up from each of us.
Some of the books were written by scientists, some of them were written by journalists, but all of them made us think more deeply about the world we live in. So let's dive in.
Okay, Dan, do you want to get the ball rolling?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. The first book I want to talk about is actually a bit of an outlier because I confess it's from 2024. This is a book that you and I both sort of were interested in and wanted to do an episode with, but the year just kind of got away from us a little bit. But it's called The Line, AI and the Future of Personhood by James Boyle. Boyle is actually a law professor at Duke. You know, there have been a series of books recently that have talked about where things stand with AI, but this one, I really liked it. It's very thorough. It's divided up into very succinct and well-defined chapters. For example, there's a chapter on whether corporations deserve a status as persons. You know, this is a thing that's been in the news over the years. But ultimately, the question that Boyle is asking is what deserves status as a person? And of course, it's not as simple as what is conscious? I mean, that's a very interesting question to ask, but it's not necessarily the only question or the most important question. With the development of large language models, things are clearly heading into sort of new territory. And as I'm sure you've noticed, Amanda, the population of Earth is sort of divided with a lot of people saying large language models are nothing. It's just an imitation. Emily Bender called them stochastic parrots. In other words, they're just spouting words that they've heard, but there's nothing, nobody home, and there's no lights on in the house, and they're just mindlessly putting together sentences. But you've got other people. There was the famous case of Blake Lemoine, the Google engineer, and recently Geoffrey Hinton has come out and said, yeah, whatever it is, we don't know exactly what LLMs are doing, but he would argue that they're basically doing something that very strongly parallels what human brains are doing. And it's a bit premature to say, no, they can't possibly be conscious no matter what. Now, I don't have a monkey in that circus or whatever, a dog in that fight. But I give Boyle credit for really laying out what the criteria are that we want to look at, what we have to think about when we're considering these things. I'll give just another example of something that most writers would have a few paragraphs on and then move on, but Boyle really sort of gets into it. And that's how to look at these cases in light of John Searle's famous Chinese room argument. John Searle was a philosopher, just actually died a few weeks ago. His famous Chinese room argument, all the way back to 1980, and really asking how a system can be conscious if when you take it apart and look at the parts, none of the parts are conscious. And there have been, it spawned a lot of literature, including interesting rebuttals from Daniel Dennett and others. And again, I'm not going to try to get into it in too much more detail here, other than to say that, as Boyle sees it, the challenge presented by large language models and their apparent success is kind of an example of the Chinese room sprung to life. So suddenly all these arguments that we've been having since 1980, and maybe they've just sort of gone away or we got tired of arguing about it, have all come back. And all these things are in the forefront again as we try to get a grip on what's conscious and what isn't, but also what deserves, some kind of respect as a person, whether it's a legal entity or whether it should have any kind of rights and that sort of thing. So again, it's not the only book that tackles it, but I think Boyle does quite a good job. So again, that book is The Line by James Boyle. All right, Amanda, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to follow that with a book that's sort of interestingly, tangentially related. And the book is a River Alive by Robert Macfarlane. I'll keep this one short because this one's my outlier because I just started reading it. So I'm not finished. It's going to be my holiday reading, which I'm very excited about. Um, so, I can't give a complete opinion, but I didn't want to leave it out because it feels like an important book. And in the first part of the book, which is where I am, Macfarlane, who's a British nature writer, journeys to a cloud forest in Ecuador to visit a river because Ecuador was the first country in the world to write legislation protecting the rights of a river. So Macfarlane writes, there are few things as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And the idea whose time has come is the rights of nature movement. So he asked the question that you were asking, Dan, which is like, if we can legally treat a corporation as a person, then what else should have rights? And for Macfarlane, he's saying, if a corporation has rights, how is it that a river doesn't? And so he looks at sort of what we have to understand about the world in order to have a legal system that truly protects the environment and in turn protects us. And the writing of this book is super poetic. At times it's like really beautiful, but at times I find it a little bit cloying. So I'm just sort of curious to see where that balance lands for me by the end. But it does feel like an important book and sort of a big book because it looks to science, to philosophy, to indigenous wisdom, to understand the living environment in ways that our politics, our grammar, and our legal categories can often obscure. So again, the book is a River Alive? And the author is Robert Macfarlane. Dan, back to you.
That sounds interesting. And yeah, I do see a parallel there because, of course, this question of what is a person, what deserves recognition as personhood. And one thing I didn't mention in Boyle's book, The Line, is there's a fair section on sort of animal rights and this question of animal consciousness. And it's all very mired in controversy and politics. And, there are groups out there that are absolutely trying to get the great apes and other creatures recognized as persons. So rivers, I mean, it might not have occurred to me on the first go round, but yeah, it is not sort of an open and shut case. Well, the next book I want to talk about is called Strata by Laura Poppick. It is a book about geology, and Laura Poppick, in fact, did sort of begin her career as a working geologist. She has now sort of transitioned into being one of us. She is basically a science writer and has written for places like National Geographic and Smithsonian. The book is sort of what it sounds like, strata, layers of rock, trying to discern the story of our planet, the story of planet Earth, based on what the rocks say. And of course, the problem is they talk kind of quietly. So they kind of
They mumble.
they mumble and they sort of speak in code. And I can't help thinking of that famous quote from Galileo, where he says something to the effect of the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, and it's only by studying squares and circles and triangles, etc., that you can come to understand the workings of nature. So by analogy, I would say like the story of Earth, the story of our planet, the world we live in, and to some extent take for granted, is written in the rocks beneath our feet. And you have to put a bit of effort into learning to read what's written, so to speak, in the rocks. Poppick is a really good writer. There's very sort of rich, vivid descriptions, textures. She kind of paints pictures of the different formations, whether it's in Newfoundland or Australia or the various places that she visits. Things that we might take for granted, like, okay, there's a great breathable atmosphere, mostly nitrogen, but about a third of it is oxygen, and that the oxygen is incredibly vital for us. We wouldn't be here, but the Earth didn't always have an atmosphere like that. So how did it come to be? What was it? What were the events that transpired to give Earth this wonderful mammal breathable atmosphere? And Poppick gets into the relevant chemistry and geophysics of that. And these days, as we battle or begin to battle global warming, or at least talk about global warming and climate change and trying to figure out what to do about it. And you've got certain researchers that are talking about geoengineering, really extravagant sounding projects about trying to manipulate or change the entire climate by doing X, Y, or Z. And Poppick argues, before we do something like that, we need to learn a lot about how the planet works. And that, yeah, that means getting into geology and really understanding how the planet evolved over 5 billion years to be the way it is today. And she dives into, specific episodes. There was a period called Snowball Earth about 720 million years ago when much of the planet was more or less frozen over. Later in the Mesozoic era, that's sort of the time of the dinosaurs, the world was much hotter due to volcanic activity, and there was lots and lots of carbon dioxide in the air. This is something that, an era that to some extent may be coming back as due to human activity, we put more carbon dioxide in the air. So I guess the main thing I want to say is that there's this kind of stereotype of geology being kind of boring. Like there's even a Simpsons episode where Lisa Simpson, who loves science, goes to like the science museum and can handle everything except for the geology exhibit, which is like just too painfully boring for her. So I think I get it. And it just brings geology to life. It really makes it interesting. So I enjoyed this book. Again, it's called Strata by Laura Poppick. Amanda, your turn.
Yeah, I keep seeing Strata in the bookstore and liking the cover, so that's great to hear about. I'm definitely going to check that one out. The next book that I liked was a book called The Giant Leap: Why Space is the Next Frontier in the Evolution of Life by Caleb Scharf. So as we all know, about 4 billion years ago, the planet woke up with life, and life steadily made its way into every ecological niche, from the deep ocean vents to rocky beaches to volcanoes and mountains and everything in between. And Scharf, who is an astrobiologist and a senior scientist at NASA, wants to argue in this book that space is just the next ecological niche that we are like inevitably compelled to occupy. So, space travel, colonization of other planets, all of this is part of our evolutionary imperative. It's just what it means to be alive. And he refers to this kind of inevitable movement of life beyond our planet as the dispersal in caps. And he writes, it is a future that life will now be driven toward by the central universal logic of natural selection and evolution. So, okay, on the one hand, I find this, it's like an interesting argument. Like, yes, life does seem to have a drive to expand and adapt, and maybe certain ecological niches on Earth seemed completely inhospitable until some species just managed to adapt to it. So maybe like Mars looks barren and hostile and poisonous to us, but so did the beach, to the primordial fish. But I also don't think this argument completely works because, for one thing, like it wasn't the fish who climbed onto the land and then just like found a way to get by as fish, right? Like the fish on land die. It's just like the species that evolves to adapt that like survives on the land. So just by that analogy, like if humans go colonize other planets, the humans are not going to survive. The only hope is that somehow like something evolves that does survive, but it's not going to be us. So like maybe you can make the argument that life as a whole has this imperative, but not for any like individual species. Like an individual species, once you find your niche and you've adapted to it, like you really should stay there. But even if you made the case that it was really for like life as a whole, I'm still not sure that works either because life as a whole is like the whole biosphere, right? Like that's like the living unit that we have this global system of all these, regulatory feedback loops that make up the whole living planet. And if you take one piece of it out of the rest, that piece doesn't continue living, which is why, like, if you just throw like a mammal out into outer space, like it doesn't
Don't,
survive.
yeah, don't do this at home.
Yeah, exactly. So, or stay home, I guess, is the real lesson here. So yeah, I mean, I thought it was like an interesting perspective to talk about this, like we have this like curiosity and this drive to explore, and that's very much like what it is to be a living thing. We kind of crawl out into the light and and find ways and adapt. But I also just don't know if that argument really extends beyond the biosphere. And, you know, the types of things that Scharf has to describe to get us to this, dispersal, include things like space elevators and giant networks of interplanetary communication that spans insane, like time distances and, building giant spinning artificial planets and all of these technological fever dreams. And then he says, like, well, we have to do this because, quote, visions of a more appealing future for life on Earth where we live sustainably and in harmony feel like a very hard reach these days. But it's like, really, is that harder than the space
Yeah.
elevators and the
Yeah.
giant spinning artificial planets? I don't know.
Yeah.
And of course, that sort of harkens back to our last episode where we talked about Adam Becker's More Everything Forever, which I'm going to mention later on. I think we both might.
Yeah, so I will mention that I read this book also, and it's fun and it's interesting and it's well written, but I think I largely shared your concern. I know listeners at home are going to be shocked that I agree with Amanda on the themes of and possible shortcomings of a book about space and evolution and that sort of thing. I know, Amanda and I do think alike in many ways, but yeah, the book, it's a lovely book, but this overarching, the whole book is anchored or tied to this drawn out analogy between Darwin's voyage on board the Beagle and us heading off into space. And no disrespect to Mr. Scharf, I just don't think the analogy works. I mean, I get that he's a fan of Charles Darwin, so am I. And reading, Darwin's journals and diaries is great, and I'm all in favor of it. But yeah, there is something weird about saying that just in the same way that life has been evolving on Earth, we're going to be pushing out into space. I think the fundamental difference is that life evolving on Earth, how can we put it, sort of just happened. I mean, I know there's a whole philosophical discussion to be had about teleology versus whatever, but roughly speaking, stuff just kind of happened and unfolded. But us going into space involves people making decisions. It's a thing that doesn't happen at all unless people wake up in the morning and go, I'd like to get into space. One of my favorite cartoons is like the fish are playing baseball underwater, and one of the fishes hits the ball up onto land, and it's a Far Side cartoon, and the caption is "Great Moments in Evolution." But of course, it's a cartoon, like it's a joke. The fish, no fish actually ever decided, oh, let's try land. Maybe land will have more opportunities for us. Whereas I think, and Amanda, perhaps you agree, but going into space involves people making specific decisions about going into space, and then we can argue whether how desperately we actually do want to go into space and that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, as you can tell, this was a provocative book. It was a really, it's a really well written, well researched book, but with a maybe questionable argument. Again, the title is The Giant Leap, and the author is Caleb Scharf. Dan, what's next on your list?
So next on my list is a book called Adaptable: How Your Unique Body Really Works and Why Our Biology Unites Us. The author is Herman Pontzer, Pontzer. He's an evolutionary anthropologist at Duke. It's just a coincidence that the guy who wrote The Line is also at Duke. We're not, I promise, I'm not getting kickbacks
This is
from
not
from
sponsored by Duke.
it's I've never even visited the Duke campus, so this is all just a coincidence. Well, what's interesting is that the book would make my top books list because if you were looking at this in the bookstore, you might just think, oh, well, okay, it's an overview of biology, so who cares? I took biology in high school. It wasn't that exciting. What is there to say? But there is more to say, and I think what I like about it is just the way you don't even have to read it in sequence. You can read the chapters one at a time or just in isolation if you wish. There's a terrific chapter on intelligence and IQ and like where do we stand on this? And is intelligence a real thing? And are different groups intelligent in different ways. All the stuff that, in fact, I was interested because the review in New Scientist called the book controversial. I actually don't think it is. I think it's just Professor Pontzer is just kind of laying out where the scientific consensus basically stands in 2025 on some of these issues. Um, there's a chapter on sex and gender, which is really good. I don't want to give away too much, but surprise, it turns out that sex and gender are kind of diverse and perhaps more diverse than some people think, or possibly more diverse than what you, dear listener, might have thought 15 years ago, right? So it's just really well argued, but also well, it's not really an argument. As I say, it's just kind of laying out where the science stands in 2025. And I mean, if it was a biology textbook, I wouldn't be reading it because why would I? But it's this really nice overview of the human body, the human mind, what's going on, how do they work, why are some of them a bit different from others, how does it relate to the rest of the animal kingdom? So I just like it. It's just a nice book about what the deal is with Homo sapiens, basically. And when they sent me, I guess I should reveal, it's not a secret anymore. It's out on the website. I was a judge. I was one of four judges participating in the Penn America E.O. Wilson science writing competition. This one made our shortlist. So did Strata, that I mentioned a few moments ago. The sorry, I said shortlist. I mean long list. 10 books that make up our kind of finalists. You can find it on the Pan America website. I'm not gonna list all 10. But that's how this book that I otherwise might not have noticed or it might not have been on my radar, same with Strata. So that's how these books sort of ended up on my kitchen table. And at any rate, I'm glad I read Strata, and I'm very glad I read this book and I'm very glad I read this book Adaptable, which I really do recommend. So as I say, it's called Adaptable. The author is Herman Pontzer. Over to you, Amanda.
Okay, the next book that I liked from 2025 is called Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon: The Untold Story by Jeffrey Kluger. So this book brings to life NASA's Gemini program, which was a 5-year, 12-mission, $1.35 billion program that launched 16 American astronauts into space between 1961 and 1966. And the importance of Gemini was that it allowed NASA to practice all the different kinds of maneuvers that it had to be able to make in order to then, take humans to the moon in the Apollo missions that followed. So these are the ones that came right before Apollo. And this is where NASA figured out how to do spacewalks and mission endurance and docking rendezvous and all of these things that they had to sort of like work up to be able to get to the moon. It also played a really key role in the Cold War politics that had the US government in a frenzy ever since Sputnik launched. And so the book takes us in these very cinematic scenes through all the different Gemini missions, what goes right, what goes wrong, all the tense moments in mission control. And Kluger, who's a journalist and an editor, has this great kind of like macho Tom Wolfe, write stuff, new journalism kind of writing style that just like
Yeah.
reeks of cigar smoke. So, like, here's a sentence that really captures the style. He writes, "The space agency was a lot of things: a showpiece for American technology, a foot soldier in the geopolitical war with the Soviets, a jumping off point from the Earth to the stars. But it was also, at least the way Washington saw it, one of the plumpest, juiciest pieces of Capitol Hill pork ever cooked up." So it's like the writing is just like so stylish.
Yeah.
And I love it because it like captures the spirit of that time. It's just like, I don't know. I thought it was great. The kind of like NASA machismo that was like part of the
Yeah.
Cold War.
Yeah.
It's this really, stylistically really good book. The only thing that keeps it from being like one of the great books of 2025 for me is that there's no real narrative arc, right? It's like, here are all the Gemini missions, like 1 through 12. And they all have they have their arcs and their dramas within each mission, but there's not like one story that takes you through the book. There's not one character that takes you through the book. It does capture this very important moment in history, and it fills in the gaps of the history of the space program because like we focus a lot on, you know, the missions that came before Gemini, where we first put people into space, and the ones after where we first get to the moon. But Gemini was sort of, I think Kluger calls it like the middle child of the NASA program. So it fills in that gap, but there's just not like one story that keeps you turning the pages. So you kind of have to be like a history buff or a NASA buff to get like really into it. But given that, I thought it was really well done. Again, the name is Gemini, and the author is Jeffrey Kluger.
Yeah, Amanda, that one landed on my kitchen table. Also, I didn't well, I sort of skimmed bits of it. I did not get a chance to read it all the way through. I guess the only thing I want to ask you is like, given that it's the awkward middle child, and
Yeah.
that I presume the book ends before or just as the Apollo missions are getting started or something to that effect. But I mean, is there any sense of I mean, as a reader, do you feel any sort of letdown that we don't quite get to the moon, or how would you put it?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, like I think as a reader, you know that, like you know that we're not going to.
Yeah.
So and it's sort of like set up to be like, okay, like we have to just get through all the steps that allow us to then do that. Which like obviously from 2025, like we know how it's gonna pan
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's still, there's like enough kind of dangerous moments where things are going wrong and, the capsule is spinning and people are losing consciousness. There's like a
Yeah. Yeah.
there's still good drama that gets you, through it in like an exciting way. But yeah, it's just sort of like this set like period of time. Yeah, but it's not going to end with like boots on the moon. But it has its excitement still. So back to you, Dan.
Yeah, the sticking roughly speaking in space, but more like physics. So the next book I want to talk about is Battle of the Big Bang: The New Tales of Our Cosmic Origins by Niayesh Afshordi and Phil Halper. The first of those two gentlemen is a physicist at the Perimeter Institute, just up the road from me in Waterloo, Ontario. And the second person is a YouTuber and science popularizer, and they kind of make a nice pair as far as this goes, because when it's physicsy stuff, it's Nayesh talking, and when it's more like interview clips from interviews that Halper has conducted on his YouTube channel, so you know that it's thanks to Halper that we're getting those bits. So anyway, they make a good team. So I guess at the heart of this book is the Big Bang model of cosmology, which says that the universe came into existence a bit less than 14 billion years ago. Of course, Amanda, you know all this stuff, but in fact, many listeners have. I mean, so far, nothing I've said is very shocking. The Big Bang is a pretty well established idea about the origins of the universe, but questions remain. Famously, for example, what is it that banged exactly? If that's never been quite clear, was there just a single bang, or could there have been multiple bangs leading perhaps to multiple universes, the so-called multiverse that we hear about a lot these days? And then, of course, what, if anything, came before? And this is where the astrophysicist and the science popularizer kind of pick up the story. One idea that they examine in great detail is the idea of cosmic inflation. Inflation is the idea that in the first kind of split second of the universe's existence, the cosmos underwent this exponential expansion, doubling in size over and over and over again, many orders of magnitude, all in just the tiniest conceivable fraction of a second. And it was not brought up just for amusement. Alan Guth and the others who worked on it were trying to solve very specific shortcomings, what they saw as shortcomings in the original Big Bang model. And the problem is we don't really have solid, unambiguous evidence that inflation actually occurred. And so we now have many competing theories. So, was it inflation, or was it this other thing? So again, the idea of the Big Bang is very well accepted, rests on quite solid ground, but the details, we're trying to figure out the details. And I will just say there's a lot of physics here, and it's a bit weird for me to put it on my list of top books and then say, oh, but don't read it because there's too much physics. I mean, it's got just the right amount of physics for people who are really into this stuff. I will say it's probably not a book for beginners. This probably shouldn't be anyone's first book on modern cosmology. But it could certainly be someone's second book, second book or third book on modern cosmology. It's just it has a lot of detail. They don't skimp on the physics. All the I mean, it's not that there's equations in it, but you know what I mean. There's just a lot of like technical stuff to try to come to grips with. And I'm just going to conclude by reading one sentence from the book where the authors write, "We have come a long way, and we should take a moment to pause and marvel at the grandeur of our playground where hard science meets imagination." So it's a really nice book for what it is. Again, like I said, not exactly for beginners, but a very nice tour of our cosmic origins. Again, the book is Battle of the Big Bang by Niayesh, Afshordi, and Phil Halper. Amanda, over to you.
So, moving from the books that I liked to the books that I loved from 2025 is a book called Conjuring the Void, The Art of Black Holes by Lynn Gamwell. Okay, so this is a really stunning book that merges art and science. It's written by Lynn Gamwell, who is an art curator and historian, and it's essentially kind of an art book. I mean, it has a lot of text. I would say if it was just the text alone, this wouldn't be like one of the books I truly loved. But it's the art that really, really makes this one. It's a special book. Last minute gift recommendation. Um, and the book starts with this question of like, how do we visualize something that is by definition invisible, right? A black hole is like literally the most invisible thing there is. So how do we see it? And of course, you can try to capture a black hole in silhouette, right? Like as a black void surrounded by a glowing outline, the accretion disk of luminous matter spinning around the black hole's event horizon. And the Event Horizon Telescope famously did this in 2019. They produced the first photograph of a black hole. And that was an amazing achievement. The black hole in the M87 galaxy was 55 million light years away, and they got this beautiful photo of it. But of course, like the black hole is not really a presence in the photo, it's an absence in the photo. So you could also try translating it into some non-visual sense. For instance, there's sonification, where you turn data into sound. And in 2003, NASA recorded a pressure wave that was emitted by a black hole and traveled through like the plasma of a galaxy cluster. So the pressure wave is like essentially like a sound wave. And they translated that into a B flat note, 57 octaves below middle C, which obviously is also long below our range of hearing. But they scaled up the pitch and got it into the range of human hearing. And you can listen to this online, and it sounds like the universe is moaning in a really creepy way. So does that really give you a sense of like seeing the black hole, hearing the black hole? Not exactly, but it does like make the black hole seem very real and alive and dynamic. So Gamble goes through this whole history of the theory and discovery of black holes, of our attempts to visualize them, see them, measure them, but also then gets into like a history of Eastern thought about the concept of nothingness and the history of abstract art. And then she sort of brings all these things together, along with like gorgeous photos and reproductions of art that deals with black holes. So, for instance, there's an artist, Anish Kapoor, an Indian and British artist, who has a piece called Non-Object Black, which is like this big circle painted with something called Vanta Black, a coating that absorbs 99.96% of visible light. And Vanta Black was developed to coat the surfaces inside of optical telescopes. So it basically makes it so non-reflective that any otherwise reflected light like that would interfere with the image that you're trying to produce just gets like absorbed. It's made of these vertically arranged carbon nanotubes that basically like trap any photons that hit them. It's like they get trapped in this maze of nanotubes and just kind of bounce around, but they don't get reflected back out. And eventually the energy is just like dissipated as heat. So it's this really wild thing to look at, even in a photo. I would be so interested to like look at this in real life, but even in a photo of it, it does truly look like you're seeing something that's not there. Like you're seeing like
Yeah.
a void.
Yeah.
And so it's called non-object black. But it looks like there's a hole in space. And so that's like a kind of artistic representation of a black hole that captures that paradoxical nature of, a thing that is no thing, a thing that destroys thingness, and it kind of bends your mind a bit. But then even more powerful in the book are these artworks that aren't exactly trying to like represent black holes, but instead are using black holes as metaphors for other kinds of darkness. So, a black hole swallows all possible light, which is a bit like swallowing all possible hope. And so artists have
Mm.
used black holes to illustrate the darkness of the Holocaust, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the shadows and dangers of political oppression and war. And Gamwell writes, the bleak atmosphere of the Cold War was reflected in art about blackness and nothingness. And this just sort of comes up in all these kind of dark circumstances where kind of nothing else does quite the same trick. Like black
Mm.
holes have this almost irrationality to them. It's not just that they're black, it's that the singularity in the heart of a black hole is a kind of irrationality in the laws of physics.
Mm.
And that really captures, something about the irrationality in real, dark times.
Yeah.
Culturally and politically, et cetera. So one of my favorite pieces in the book is called Full Stop by the British artist John Latham. And it's a painting of what appears to be a black hole, but of course the term full stop is the British phrase for the period at the end of a sentence.
Mhm.
And so the black hole in the painting is also like a punctuation mark. And Latham's work in general deals with like what he's called the cultural voids. He deals a lot with book burnings.
Mm.
So sort of like this nothingness that results when authoritarian, leaders try to take control of language. And so the black hole is sort of like the end of space and time, but the full stop is the end of communication and civil discourse. So that one was really moving. And there's also a photo of this incredible piece by a Japanese-born artist, Chihara Shiota. I hope I'm saying that correctly, called In Silence. And the artwork was an installation, so it's a photo of this installation, but it was a grand piano surrounded by chairs, like as if there was going to be a performance with an audience. But the piano and the chairs have been burned to like a black, black char.
Well,
And then all of it has been wrapped in these threads of black wool that form this like kind of giant cobweb or cocoon around the whole scene. And it's just the most haunting image. Like there's no musician, no audience, just the charred remains of a piano and chairs that are like wrapped in this black silence. And it just looks like this scene that was like lost to time or entropy or bombing or I mean it's a truly truly haunting image, and it's one of those examples of the image being worth 1,000 words. And so I will say, in terms of the words, the writing of the book is not like amazing. It's kind of academic and dry, which is
mm.
a shame because it's like such interesting stuff. Um, but the artwork is so powerful that it's worth spending time with. So that book is Conjuring the Void by Lynn Gamwell.
Sounds really interesting. And just to clarify, is this like a big, thick, heavy coffee table book that you would flip through in your living room? Or, I mean, I don't know, it's probably not out in paperback yet, but could you imagine taking the paperback to the beach and reading it?
Definitely not a beach, more a coffee table. Yeah.
Okay, okay. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah. Back to you, Dan. What's next on your list?
Well, now I am also into my set of books that I loved, and I want to talk about the new book by veteran science writer Sam Kean. That's Kean. Some people will know his earlier books, The Disappearing Spoon or The Violinist's Thumb. His books always have kind of groovy titles and kind of eye-catching covers. So he has a new book called Dinner with King Tut: How Rogue Archaeologists Are Recreating the Sights, Sounds, Smells, and Tastes of Lost Civilizations. And perhaps just from the title and subtitle, people can get a bit of a sense of where this is going. The way Kean sees it, traditional archaeology is too dry. So it's great, but it's a little bit too dull for his tastes, a little bit too academic. So his plan for making archaeology more exciting is that he embarks on a kind of a globe-spanning quest where he's not just trying to uncover facts about ancient cultures, but to live as those people lived. So that's really the hook, or I mean, if you don't like it, you would call it a gimmick, but I'll call it the hook or the theme that underlies all of this. So he starts off in Africa 75,000 years ago. This, of course, would be the late Paleolithic, I guess, and he finishes off in 16th century Mexico. And along the way, he has, I mean, and this is going to sound a bit cheesy, but he has all these adventures. He's learning how to flake stone tools the way our Paleolithic ancestors did. He learns to bake bread the way ancient Egyptians did. He learns to craft a canoe the way an ancient Polynesian would have done it. And as he travels the world, he meets up with these various rogue archaeologists that are mentioned in the book's subtitle. And often they're not professionals. I mean, sometimes they are, sometimes they work at a university, but often they're sort of keen amateurs who learn by doing. They're just as curious and just as interested as professionals, but they're using their hands. They're learning this stuff by actually doing it.
I'm dying to know if this is gonna be like a documentary or a Netflix series or something
You
because it sounds
know,
perfect for it.
my answer to that is yes, it would make an awesome documentary, but I think the only way it can be a documentary is if he took a film crew with him when he was
The
doing
whole
that stuff.
time,
Because
yeah.
I can't begin, even as full of energy as Sam Kean surely is, I can't imagine him going back to all of these places,
Doing it again.
doing it all again with the camera crew. So I don't know. Hopefully at least he shot a lot of smartphone video that he can use to make a mini documentary, or
Yeah.
maybe there's already a short promo doc. I simply don't know. But yeah, it's the kind of thing that you can easily envision as a TV documentary or even as a radio documentary. I say that as a big fan of radio documentaries. And the only other thing I want to say about the book is that, of course, it is nonfiction, but it includes a series of brief fictional vignettes, I guess we can call them. So these are like mini chapters, each of them just 5, 6, 7 pages long, where Kean imagines the lives of people who lived in these far off times and places. So invents characters and dilemmas and situations that they're in and just tells little stories. I'll just say this, I would struggle mightily with this because I mean, writing fiction is, I struggle with that from the get-go. But in this case, you're writing about a far off place at a far off time, and you have to not fall into the trap of writing about it from the 21st century perspective. So
Yeah.
it's a struggle. You have to really put your mind into the mind of that long dead person. And Amanda, I think you'll agree that's difficult.
Yeah.
It's just hard to get inside the head of someone so far removed from us in both space and time, but especially time. And I'll just say that the vignettes, I mean, you can debate whether, maybe Kean is a better nonfiction writer than a fiction writer, whatever, but the vignettes bring to life people we might otherwise really only know from a few dusty artifacts in a museum. So I really appreciate that he went this extra mile, and it really does separate this book from, I guess I will say, there are other books about how the human species and human civilization got to be where it is today, and they all overlap a little bit. So I will say this one is different. So in a field where it might seem difficult to make an original contribution, Sam Kean has given us a book that really does feel kind of new. So again, the book is called Dinner with King Tut, and the author is Sam Kean. Amanda, your turn.
Okay, so my runner-up for favorite science book of 2025 is a book called Do Aliens Speak Physics and Other Questions About Science and the Nature of Reality by Daniel Whiteson and Andy Warner. So, okay, this was a really fun one. Daniel Whiteson is a particle physicist at UC Irvine, and Andy Warner is a cartoonist and author. So the book is like a mix of text and cartoons. And it's all presented in like this very casual, almost like silly, fun way. Like it comes across like if you just flip through it, it looks like a very, very light book. Um, and as I'll explain, like that's a little deceptive. So the question the book starts with is if aliens show up on our planet, could they give us the answers to physics that we're looking for? And if so, would we understand them?
This is a great question, by the way.
Right? So, like, the presumption is that, like, okay, if aliens were technologically advanced enough to actually travel to Earth from, whatever solar system they come from, then they probably have a better understanding of physics than we do. And so the question is, like, could they teach us what they know? And then the first question you have to ask is, like, well, let's say they tried, assume they want to, and they're trying to communicate with us. Could we understand them? And as the authors write, could we understand them as they sparkle, whirl, murmur, or bubble?
Yeah.
Which I really like the idea that instead of talking, they sparkle or
Yeah.
bubble.
Yeah.
So as the authors point out, like before we even think about decoding an alien language, think how hard it is just to decode a human language, like from ancient times, right? Like
Mhm.
linguists took 20 years to decipher the Rosetta Stone and they had a cheat sheet. Um,
Yeah.
and that's not to mention like other life forms on Earth, like whales and octopuses. I mean, we can truly like barely manage to communicate with other primates, and they share nearly all of our DNA. So,
I'll just say sometimes it's hard for humans to talk to other humans.
yeah, like our neighbors.
Yeah.
So yeah, truly, like, what hope is there for aliens? And this is the point at which scientists optimistically turn to mathematics. So mathematics is supposed to be like a universal language, like Dan, as you had said, Galileo was like the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. So no matter how many tentacles you have, no matter what galaxy you're from, 1 plus 1 still equals 2. Um, but does it? Um, so the authors write, what if the aliens arrive sloshing around in plasma environments where these distinctions are so fuzzy that the concept of a countable individual doesn't exist and counting and arithmetic are unknown to them? Which is like presented in this sort of silly way, like, silly cartoony way. But this is where the book like goes really deep because
Yeah.
there are things that we think of as being inherent features of reality that might actually be contingent on our particular embodied ways of living, in ways that we don't even realize. Like, yes, what if the aliens don't carve the world into countable numbers? It's not that far-fetched. In quantum physics, all electrons are identical. Not like just similar, but literally identical to the point that it doesn't make sense to count them as more than one. And this like comes
Mhm.
up in the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And so like the physicist John Wheeler used to say there's just one electron in the universe. Um, but the point is like if you don't start from certain assumptions that come from classical physics, which comes from our way of being in the world at a certain scale and whatever, that arose in our kind of historical trajectory, more or less by accident, then these categories and like into which you divvy up the world might be very different. And your rules of mathematics, if you even have mathematics
Yeah.
or rules, might reflect that.
I just want to jump in for a second to say how,
Yeah,
first of all, I have a copy of the book. I'm looking forward to diving in. This issue of, dividing up the world or not, counting or not is so, I mean, of course, it's mind-boggling, but the reason it's mind-boggling is because it's so fundamental to us and it's so fundamental that we don't even think about it. We absolutely
exactly.
take it for granted. Now, I mean, I don't have children myself, but people who have, what's the first thing that a parent teaches a child? They say, mama, dada, and you teach them one, two, three.
Yeah.
Like they look at their fingers and they start counting. I mean, well, maybe I left out maybe one or two other very simple things that they learn first, but it's just so fundamental before you can do anything else, before you understand, tomorrow and yesterday, before you understand up and down. It's just this idea that stuff comes in discrete units. And then, of course, I'm sure all this is in the book, but without numbers, do you get mathematics? And if you don't have mathematics, how do you do physics? But again, so back to the Galileo quote. I mean, I'm not saying you can't. Maybe you can do physics without any math. I know I actually probably would have enjoyed certain physics classes more if you could do them without any math. But it's never been. I mean, they were so integrated. I mean, as an undergraduate, when I was doing my physics degree, I was taking math, moderately advanced math courses at the exact same time out of necessity if you weren't taking the math courses, you couldn't understand what the professor was saying in the physics classes. And geez, I mean, I'm trying to picture like an octopus-like alien that dispensed with all that and still invented rockets, but
Yeah.
it's a
Well,
struggle.
it's funny, the authors, they do address this, and they have a great point where they say, like, something like, you can make chicken soup without knowing thermodynamics. Um, so you kind of can imagine like scenarios where a creature just knows how to do things without necessarily having like rules and mathematics that like describe why it works.
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, or they could just have a very different kind of mathematics or very different kinds of physics.
yeah, yeah,
So these are all the questions that they get into, and it's like you see how quickly it gets like very deep.
yeah,
And so yeah, like the authors, they start asking all these questions about what is the alien science like? What are alien ways of thinking? And it forces us to confront like the contingencies of our own thinking or like things that seem universal to us, and then all of a sudden you say, wait a minute, maybe that's not universal. Maybe that's just how we do things, like the little kid counting on their fingers, it's because they have fingers. So but then they end up asking like things like, what if quantum mechanics was understood before relativity? Like, how would we think about the world then? What if complex numbers were understood but not real numbers? Like, how might our whole
yeah,
conception of reality be different? And you start to think like, wow, maybe there's more that's just sort of like happens to be the way we did things, and not so much like a reflection of, the truth with a capital T. And then the next thing they sort of get into is like, well, how do the particular sensory systems that we evolved play a role, right? Like, could aliens with different senses, not just like our usual modes of, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, make them more attuned to aspects of physics that we find really confusing? So, for instance, the authors say, what if the aliens evolved? Imagine they evolved on a planet that's orbiting a pair of binary stars. So they have two suns.
mm,
And that results in really complicated gravitational tides.
mm.
Could their embodied sense, like their just automatic lived sense of gravitational flux, lead them to more easily build a warp drive capable of surfing shortcuts through curved space and time?
I'm going to go with a maybe on that.
It's a strong maybe. Yeah.
Strong maybe.
Um, and this leads us into these questions about what they call the Umwelt, like the
Yeah,
perceptual world
yeah,
that we inhabit, which is kind of like a subset of the full physical reality.
yeah.
You know, we see visible light, but there's this whole spectrum of electromagnetic radiation that we don't see. And, right now we're all steeped in dark energy, and there's dark matter everywhere, and there's neutrinos that are raining through us, and we don't experience all of that. But we know it's there because we found ways to connect those sort of invisible things like back into information that we can actually perceive, right?
Yeah.
That's how technology works to extend our senses. Um, but then you could ask, like, well, who knows what else is out there, right? Like, if an alien is standing right next to us but has dramatically different senses, could it be like they're just basically in a parallel universe? And the authors write, there could be yet more invisible, intangible, but useful information flowing through the universe that we simply aren't aware of. And if there is, then some alien out there could be using a strange new kind of ear, eye, or tongue to lap up that knowledge. So this whole book it's like really charming, it's really funny, but mostly it's just surprisingly profound. Like personally for me, I didn't think the cartoons added that much to the book. But that might just be like my taste. I'm not like the most visual person always. And maybe for other people, the cartoons and kind of the silliness of some of the language like would be the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. But the thing is that the medicine is so good, like the writing is so good, the ideas are so good that the sugar can just be like a little distracting and maybe even like a little condescending at
Hmm,
times.
hmm.
That was like my feeling. Although I will say there are some like laugh out loud moments. There's a part where the authors are trying to decide who would be the best person to consult regarding the universality of mathematics. And they make a list that they say it would have to be someone that one, thinks deeply about the nature of language and thought, two, would answer a cold email with aliens in the subject line, and three, looks like a wizard. And this list perhaps inevitably converges on Noam Chomsky.
I was
So
wondering. Yeah, I don't think Noam Chomsky has a beard, which means he doesn't look like a traditional wizard. However, I figured this sentence was heading to Chomsky. The only other person that came to mind is maybe Daniel Dennett, who died about a year and a half ago. But
yeah,
yeah,
that's
Chomsky.
true. He had some wizardness, and yeah, I think he met all of those.
He would have
I
had
don't know
whether.
how he felt about email, but
Oh, that's right.
yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I had emailed him, that's for sure. But whether he would reply right away to an email with aliens in the subject line, I'm not sure. Anyway, please continue.
So it's like it's a really fun book, but it's also a very deep book about, what it means to perceive, to calculate, to communicate, and just essentially to do science at all. Again, the name is Do Aliens Speak Physics? And the authors are Daniel Whiteson and Andy Warner. So back to you, Dan.
So now we're getting to the two books that, in my opinion, are a tie for runner-up for Best Science Book of the Year. And one of them, I think we can deal with fairly quickly because we've already reviewed it. I'm talking about More Everything Forever by Adam Becker, which episode 39 was all about that. And for listeners who missed it, go back and listen to episode 39 because Amanda and I had a very nice interesting, fruitful discussion about Adam Becker's book. Amanda, do you want to say, before I go on to my other number two book, do you want to say anything about More Everything Forever?
Well, I guess I will just add that I have this listed as my tie for number one.
Ooh,
So we can come back to it.
okay, fair enough. I'll continue with my other runner-up for my pick for Science Book of the Year, which is The Mind Electric, A Neurologist on the Strangeness and Wonder of Our Brains by Priya Anand. Anand is a neurologist. She's now based in Boston, but she has worked all over the world. She's originally from India. And honestly, this book, I mean, I'm choosing it as a runner-up. It could easily compete with my number one pick, which you're going to hear about in a moment. It's a really good book. I can also say that it was also among the 10 books that are on the long list that I talked about earlier for the Pan America E.O. Wilson Science Writing Award. But The Mind Electric is terrific. So people listening to this are aware that the human brain is like no other structure in the universe. 80 billion plus neurons. The number of connections is way up there, like 100 trillion plus. And this, and Amanda, I appreciate that you have certain thoughts about this, which because the philosophy of mind is a whole big thing that we can put aside just for the moment.
Put a pin
But
in
but the
it.
yeah, the brain is a wonderful, complicated structure that makes us who we are. And it's also fragile. It's a fragile organ, and when something goes wrong, reality can get turned upside down for the person experiencing the particular issue. So, as I mentioned, Anand is a neurologist. A lot of these interesting stories about the brain come from her own clinical practice, but she's also very well read. I mean, she just pulls stories and ideas and quotations from all over the place. Um, and these stories, I mean, you could imagine them being just like a random connection, but they really work in unison to reveal truths about the human condition. So that's my read on it. I will just say, and listeners may already be having this thought, but Anand is not the first neurologist to tell stories about various patients with brain issues, because of course Oliver Sacks built a career on doing this kind of thing. Oliver Sacks died in 2015, a decade ago. So some of the blurbs, like some of the comments on the flap copy and the back of the book, at least two of them draw a comparison to Oliver Sacks. If Anand didn't mention him, he would be like the elephant in the room. Oh my God, why isn't she saying that there has already been a neurologist who did this kind of thing? Well, of course she does. She does acknowledge it. Acknowledge it. She was clearly influenced by and has a somewhat of a reverence for Oliver Sacks and his works. But let me just stress that Anand absolutely has her own distinct voice. So when you read it, you don't think this is Oliver Sacks 2.0. You just think here is a wonderful book in a kind of territory which Oliver Sacks has previously ventured into. Does that make sense? It's new. This is new, even if the type of thing may sound a little bit familiar with some readers.
Yeah, yeah. And it's
Um,
probably like that's probably worth pointing out because now there's been like some stuff that's come out about Oliver Sacks
That's
and
right.
like
So there have been some revelations about
yeah.
how original or truthful or not some of Oliver Sacks's stories are. And I guess we can also say, I mean, these blurbs on the back of Anand's book were obviously written before those revelations came to light. So maybe I'm speculating here when the paperback comes out, they'll just delete those allusions to Oliver Sacks since he has fallen from grace somewhat. So we witness all manner of unusual medical cases. There's an epilepsy patient who's plagued by the same four chords from a Van Halen song, which keep repeating in her head.
Oh
There's a
no.
patient who sees the color of her son's T-shirt changing from red to green and then back to red. There's a patient, I mean, this is kind of mind-boggling, but there's a patient who insists they've already died. Um, and you could imagine if these stories were not told with compassion and with taste and generosity, it would be a different kind of book and it might be a bit unpleasant. But I want to say, in no way does this feel exploitative. Like Anand, this sounds very cheesy, but it's bursting with compassion. She really is just making every conceivable effort to try to understand what these people are going through, and then what can we learn? What can we learn about these conditions? What kind of treatments can we come up with? And I'll just add that these stories are kind of woven effortlessly together, kind of intermixed with Anand's own story, which is very interesting given her background and her upbringing. And the result is just a terrific book. It's hard to put down. I know everybody says that about every book, but The Mind Electric is just a terrific read. So again, it's called The Mind Electric by Priya Anand. Well, we're getting very near the top, so Amanda, take it away.
Okay, well, first of all, that book sounds amazing and I've just added it to my to read list. For my top book, top science book of 2025, for me it was a tie between Adam Becker's book, More Everything Forever, which we just mentioned, um, and the other book I will reveal in one moment. I guess I'll just say about Becker, um, it just, I hope people do go back. If you haven't heard episode 39, where we, spend the whole episode just talking about Becker's book, I hope you'll go back and listen to that because it was such like a much needed book. I think that's why it's really here at the top of my list because it just feels like incredibly relevant and timely and needed. It's like a much needed cold shower on the whole Silicon Valley billionaire techno utopian dream of like
Which, by the way, has been sucking up a lot of oxygen recently.
yes, exactly. Exactly. That's why I just think this book is like such an antidote. And he really just talks about their kind of dream of like infinite growth and through AGI and space colonization and all of these things and he shows how it's kind of like this religion or ideology of like technological salvation that the billionaires want to believe in because it promises the only things that their money can't buy. He makes a very compelling case and it allows you to kind of have just like a reasonable perspective on things that have really gotten like blown up in our sort of cultural dialogue right now. So yeah, love that book and highly, highly recommend if you haven't read it. And again, our last episode, goes into everything about it. So that was my tie for number one. My other pick for the best science book of 2025 is called Ripples on the Cosmic Ocean, an environmental history of our place in the solar system by Dagomar Degroot. And maybe I will start by saying that I hate the title of this book, but I
Mm.
love the book.
Mhm.
I found the book very surprising and possibly because of the title. Okay, so Ripples on the Cosmic Ocean, it just sounds like, first of all, I feel like there have been other books called very similar things. It
Yeah.
sounds like it's going to be like a generic book about gravitational waves or just like
Yes. Yes, that's
space
the
or
first thing
whatever.
that went through my head, gravitational
Yeah, and
waves.
so like
Yeah.
you just wouldn't even pick it up if you weren't interested in that. But it turns out that's not what it's about. This book is actually very unique. I've never read anything quite like it. It sort of straddles academic and popular writing. It's something in the middle, and it doesn't always hit the sweet spot there, but the material is so interesting that it's fine. And actually, the writing is very good. It's just at times like a bit scholarly. But the book is about, as Degroot puts it, the ways in which real or perceived changes in the cosmic environment have shaped affairs here on Earth. So, Degroot is an environmental historian at Georgetown University. And to be honest, I didn't realize environmental history was a field, but it
Mm-hmm.
but it is. So environmental historians study how the natural environment shapes the history of humanity and vice versa. So to give a really interesting example that DeGroot used in the book, colonialism in South and Central America led to a brief period of global cooling. I had never heard this before, but when the Spanish came to South and Central America and like forced indigenous people to migrate to new regions, or they enslaved them, or they introduced new pathogens that they had no immunity to and killed much of the population. All of that tragedy and horror resulted in these vast tracts of farmland being abandoned. And so in those areas, the rainforest actually expanded, and then, we're able to capture more carbon dioxide, and it was enough to actually lower the temperature of the planet. And then in this twist, the cooling from that led to failed harvests in Spanish territories in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So, so as an environmental historian, De Groot is like looking at history in terms of these like interplays of the natural and the cultural. But De Groot is sort of unique in that he's not just looking at the climate on Earth, but actually like the larger climate of the whole solar system. So, climate on other planets, like the moon's effects on the Earth, solar activity, how all of these things kind of intersect with human activity and human culture. And this turns out to be really fascinating. So, for instance, in one section of the book, he goes through the history of like all the things that scientists thought that they saw on the surface of the moon and the surface of other planets. Um, so, like, soon after telescopes were invented, scientists and cartographers were trying to like map the lunar surface, right? But
Yeah.
one of the things they didn't know many things. And one of the things they didn't know was that the lunar soil is full of glass, which forms from like the heat of meteorite impacts. And then the moon has no atmosphere. And so the sunlight like reflects off the glass in this very direct way where it reflects back to its source and not off to the side. And so features on the lunar surface that are usually invisible, if the sun is like directly overhead, they suddenly like come into focus. And so you can get this illusion that things are like moving and changing on the surface of the moon.
Hmm.
And there are just a million confounding things like this. Like this is just one little example. Not to mention like the limitations of all the optical technologies at the time that made it very, very confusing for people to figure out what they were looking at. And so that's why even exceptionally good scientists, people like Caroline and William Herschel, who you've talked a lot about, Dan, like they counted 150 active volcanoes on the moon. Um, they saw canals, pyramids, roads, forested mountains. Other scientists saw a city with smoke rising from chimneys. There was like a Harvard scientist who thought that migratory birds flew to the moon for the winter. And then in 1835, a newspaper, the New York Sun, kind of tabloidish thing, published the series of articles claiming that John Herschel, William's son, had made these observations of the moon where he saw like half man, half bat winged creatures.
Yeah.
And importantly, these creatures came in a racial hierarchy, with dark skinned man bats being inferior to the light skinned man bats.
What a
And
shock. What
yeah.
what
And
the
so obviously, like Herschel never made any of these observations. The whole thing was a hoax. Um, but De Groot's point was that, like, what people wanted to see in the cosmic environment was just like this reflection of their own sociocultural biases and anxieties on Earth. And this hoax happened at a time in New York where there was all of this like social and political unrest, and specifically around debates about slavery. And so it's like this combination of like the scientists like didn't fully understand what they're seeing, and that kind of made room for people to imagine things. And the imagination very much reflected, things going on here. And then in the late 1800s, when scientists thought that they had discovered this series of engineered canals on Mars, that actually coincided with these weather events on Earth, like El Nino and La Nina events that were causing these severe droughts. And so Degroot writes, amid such widespread devastation on Earth, the idea that Martians had engineered their planet to survive the ultimate drought naturally captured widespread attention and for a while convinced many scientists. So there's this projection of all these like norms and anxieties onto space, but also, of course, space has very real impacts here on Earth, and especially in terms of solar storms. So that makes up a big portion of the book as well. Like we learned that in August of 1972, solar storms detonated 4,000 US mines in Vietnam.
That's shocking. That's
Isn't
amazing.
that wild? And in 1967, there was a burst of radio waves from the sun that scrambled US radar stations, and the Air Force officers at the time just assumed that the Soviets had like jammed their equipment. And this actually almost led to a nuclear conflict. It was like a very close call. So solar storms are like capable of, taking out satellites and power grids. And, they also make beautiful northern lights. Like I've been appreciating the
Yeah.
variability of solar weather ever since I moved out to the country, and we've had all of these amazing geomagnetic storms that have lit up the skies with aurora. And these storms have been like messing with human technology ever since the invention of the compass, right? A solar flare could really mess with like a magnetic compass and mess with navigation back in the day. But the more that our technology develops, the more reliant we are on it. The more interconnected our lives are with like solar weather. So I think what this book really left me with, and this is why it's my number one, was like this real visceral feeling for the continuity between what goes on Earth and what goes on in space. Like usually we think of our technology as like this thing that's very distinct from nature, but when you start to see all of our technology as like nothing but twists and knots in this huge mesh of electromagnetic field lines that like weave together the entire solar system, you just get this very like visceral feel for your place in a much larger picture. And to me, those kinds of like perspective shifts in thinking are just the best things that science books can do for us. So that's why this one is at the top for me. And again, the title is Ripples on the Cosmic Ocean, and the author is Dagomar Degroot.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I did a few weeks ago, I wrote a lengthy-ish piece for Smithsonian on solar storms, geomagnetic storms, and what they can do, what they have done in the past, and what they may do for us. So if people are curious, they can look that up on Smithsonian. But no, this really sounds interesting, especially because while we're used to hearing stories about the incredibly complex ongoing interplay between our environment and us, our species and our culture and our civilization, we don't often get that extra layer where it's like, oh, but it's not just the earth, it's not just the biosphere, it's not just the atmosphere and the oceans, but it's also like further out, like space, like the sun and I don't know, cosmic rays. I mean, I haven't read the book yet. I'd like to. It sounds really interesting, but yeah, supernovas, and where we live here on Earth is impacted by all of those things. The other thing I was going to say is that I've always been a bit, I don't know, put off or disconcerted or something like that about this issue that astronomers or anyone, it could be just writers, it could even be novelists, looking out into space or thinking about space and then like, whoops, accidentally seeing ourselves. Like just,
Right.
the things that we imagine we see out there are just sort of reflections of, I mean, you mentioned slavery and yeah, racial tensions and so on. And I'll just say this as an aside. I've been watching season one, and I'm about to watch season two of Andor, which is, part of the Star Wars franchise. And it's fine. And, people don't have to email me to disagree with this unless they want to. But the Empire, right? We all know the evil Empire from Star Wars, and the Empire, it sort of gets further developed, and we learn more about its workings. And of course, the many people trying to resist the Empire's evil, greedy doings. And it's like, okay, fine, but the Empire, like they're Nazis. Of course, they're not called Nazis, but they're basically Nazis. They're sort of bent on world domination. I mean, there's some subtle reasons why one might say no, they're not Nazis, but basically they're Nazis. And then the resistance fighters are basically World War II era resistance fighters, and which is look, I'm not saying I could do any better, but there is this just weird thing where you try so hard to write a story about the depths of space, and it's like, yeah, but it's actually kind of about Earth. So it's just a thing. And look, there is no solution to that, because if all the characters were sort of weird blobby octopuses with blobby octopus type problems, nobody would watch it because it wouldn't be relatable, and that's the way it is.
Unless we could find out if they have like countable numbers or not.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah.
there you go.
Speaking of countable numbers, Dan, I am dying to hear what your number one pick is.
Yes, indeed. We are at the top of my list now, and there is going to be a little bit of overlap with the book that you've just been describing. This book is called The Martians, The True Story of an Alien Craze That Captured Turn of the Century America by David Barron. David Barron is another sort of experienced science writer who's written on a whole variety of topics and has done a lot of broadcast work. So Mars, right? You've mentioned it just briefly just now. I think I think we will all agree there is something about the planet Mars that kind of tugs at the imagination. It's kind of like a parallel version of our own world. At least this is how we're tempted to think of it, right? Similar enough that we kind of fantasize about going there. And for our younger listeners, if you eat your vegetables and stay healthy, maybe you will witness the first human beings on Mars, possibly. And yet different, right? And in fact, this is something that Adam Becker and others have pointed out. It is not exactly a carbon copy of Earth. It is very different, a very harsh environment, and even our most exotic deserts or ice fields here on Earth are actually not all that similar to what you would find on Mars, as it turns out. So David Barron is fascinated by Mars, but in particular, he wants to dissect the interest that Earthlings took in the red planet around the year 1900, actually a decade or two before 1900 and also a decade or two after that. There's a whole bunch of historical characters that we get to meet in the book, but first and foremost is the American astronomer Percival Lowell, who was originally from Boston, but would end up founding the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. And Amanda, you touched on this very briefly, but the key thing is that he was looking through this state-of-the-art telescope, and he saw, or at least he kind of thought he saw, an elaborate network of canals when the telescope was aimed at Mars. And of course, here we get a blend of astronomy. I mean, you could say this book is like history of astronomy, but psychology and sociology really come into it, because the overarching question is, well, what did he actually see? I mean, what was the difference between the photons entering Lowell's retina and what he said he was seeing, what he claimed and told people, what he told the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, that he was seeing. And Lowell argues, and I think I'm sure this is correct, Lowell had no desire to deceive. He wasn't a con artist. He wasn't, unlike the Great Moon hoax from a few decades earlier, which was made up. I mean, that was a work of fiction deliberately set out as fiction, but in a way that would deceive sort of gullible readers, and eventually people learned that it was hoax. But at any rate, this is different from that. Lowell, as far as we know, Lowell actually, he drew sketches and diagrams, and then he described his findings to his various colleagues, and he apparently, as far as we can tell, saw, I have to, like saw in quotation marks, but this is what he thought he saw. So I think this is fascinating because, first of all, I mean, I'm an astronomy enthusiast. Of course, I knew about Percival Lowell, and anyone who's sort of into astronomy, and if you're at all into the history of astronomy, you know something about Percival Lowell and the canals. But I've never really satisfactorily, until David Barron's book, seen an analysis of like what's going on, like why did he think he saw that? How come other astronomers which were who were divided, by the way. A few of them also saw the canals, which is sort of incredible, given that there are no no canals, and others did not. So it gets kind of complicated, but in an interesting way. And I don't want to, go into too many of the details of the things that Barron gets into, but two things. First of all, Barron has a lot of sympathy for Lowell, and I guess there was a time in the 1890s where Lowell was delivering a series of lectures at MIT talking about the canals. By this time, he was developing his theory that the equatorial regions on Mars were drying up, so this dying civilization was desperately doing these grand engineering works to divert water from the polar regions to the equatorial regions to to save Martian civilization. And I'll just quote this one sentence. Lowell made his case with such casual confidence and seeming logic that had I been in that MIT auditorium in 1895, I can imagine myself being swept along. And I like that he says that because this is the problem with writing about stuff that happened in the past. Like, are you writing it from the perspective of, well, today in 2025, we know blah blah blah, but you're trying to figure out what was
Right,
it
like you're
like.
like that sounds so ridiculous, but at the time, like no one had any idea what was
No
on
one had
Mars.
any idea. So I'm glad he
Yeah.
says that, and I will humbly say that I'm sure I would have been swept right along with everybody else. Here's a fascinating episode that I'll just describe very, very briefly. So astronomers around the world were trying to grapple with this. As I said, a few, not a large number, also claimed to see the canals. Many did not and were skeptical. So there was an astronomer in Britain named Edward Walter Maunder. I presume the Maunder minimum is named after him. That's from solar physics, but whatever. Well, that's not part of Barron's book. But this guy Maunder devised an ingenious experiment, which basically gets into the psychology of this. So he got a bunch of schoolboys in Greenwich, which is a suburb of London, to sit in a big auditorium. Some of them closer to the front, some of them in the middle, some of them in the back, trying to copy a drawing that he himself drew and just sort of scotch taped to the wall, not scotch, whatever, but hung up at the front of the classroom for these kids. I'm sure they were all male, for these kids to look at. And the drawings were of just various nondescript blotches, but on a circular disk. So, in other words, reminiscent of what a planet would look like, or what you might reasonably expect a planet to look like through a telescope eyepiece, right? It's going to be round because planets are round, but then what about the details, right? So okay, of course, the further you sat from the front of the room, the smaller the original appeared. So copying it was more difficult, obviously. So the boys were instructed every boy had a pencil and a piece of paper and it was like, reconstruct this. Like, we know you're sitting far away, but what do you think this drawing looks like? What do you think it would look like if you could walk up closer to it? And many of the boys' drawings included straight lines, even though there were no straight lines on the original drawing.
Huh.
So this kind of dose of psychology, I mean, you might think would pull the plug on Lowell's imaginings, but it didn't. It did not have that effect. He stood his ground and said, no, 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 the canals are really there. And it's just fascinating the way it unfolded because people eventually built bigger telescopes, which you would think would settle the matter. And in a certain sense, they did, in that eventually the canals just went away. Like astronomy, like every science, is kind of a community endeavor, and the community eventually reaches some sort of consensus. And the consensus that the community came to by 1915, 1920, 1925 is that no, we're just not seeing the canals. They're not there. But it is interesting that at no point did Lowell say, oh yeah, you got me. Like, he just wasn't willing to give it up in spite of observations made through larger telescopes like the one at Mount Wilson in California, which was substantially bigger than his refracting telescope in Arizona, and photography. Now, photography was actually invented some decades prior to that, 1830s-ish, give or take. But in terms of doing sophisticated photography through a telescope, that's more like a turn of the 20th century type of thing. And so, indeed, photographs were taken through the Clark refractor, the refractor at the Lowell Observatory. I mean, by Lowell himself. I mean, and again, I don't want to give away the whole book, but Amanda, you could probably guess what happened next, which is that Lowell held up these teeny weeny little photos and said, look, here's the proof that the canals are real. And other people said, what the hell? What are those blotches that you're showing us? So it's just fascinating. And when I ended up reviewing this book for Undark, and they let me get away with this one of my favorite analogies, which is that it's a little bit like Snuffleupagus. So if you know Sesame Street, you've got this character Snuffleupagus, which for a long time only Big Bird could see him, and that's just, to me, this feels like what this is like. So again, I don't want to give away the entire book because it's good and it goes on for a bit. But those are it's this fascinating mix of astronomy, history of astronomy, a bit of psychology, a bit of sociology. And Barron, now I don't know, I don't know if he got a grant or where he got the money from, but he goes everywhere. And I just don't just mean to Arizona, which would be the bare minimum, but he goes to South America to find the ruins of an observatory that two of Lowell's colleagues, there's a husband and wife team, their name escapes me right at the moment, but they went to South America because there was going to be an even better view from such and such mountain the next time Mars came to its closest approach to Earth, and that observatory, as I say, it doesn't exist anymore. It's just ruins. But and I don't think they're like substantially visited ruins. They're ruins that are just off some dirt road that you'd have to know where to go to even find it. And he finds it and he looks around, and it's just, you don't, I mean, not every book has to be like that. You can write a reasonably good nonfiction book from your armchair, I guess, if you have an internet connection and maybe a library card. But I admire authors who go to all the different places that they're talking about. And the depth of research is wonderful. Yeah, Barron has clearly plowed through hundreds of issues of old newspapers and old magazines, seeing what was written about these alleged discoveries at the time. And it's just, as I'm saying this, perhaps listeners will deduce that I'm also a bit jealous, and I am, because it's the kind of book that I imagine myself doing with all this research into archives and digging up all this old material. But obviously I didn't do it, and Barron did. So kudos to him. It's a lovely book, a lovely mix of astronomy and other sciences. So yeah, big thumbs up for me. For me, this is the top science book of the year. Again, I've been talking about The Martians by David Barron.
Well, there you have it. Those are our picks for 2025, and I hope it's given listeners lots of new titles to add to their to be read pile for some cozy winter reading. I've definitely just added a number of them to mine, so thank you for that, Dan.
Yeah, well, thank you also, Amanda. This is great, and I've added books to my list too. And as I say, I think 2025 was a pretty good year for science books as these things go. And yeah, fingers crossed. I look forward to seeing a whole new crop of cool science books in the year ahead. You've been listening to episode 40 of BookLab. You can find us on a variety of audio platforms as well as YouTube. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/BookLabPodcast, and do look for Amanda and myself on your favorite social media platforms, including Blue Sky.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the new year on BookLab.